So are you willing to step into the wild? Some of you might be thinking, I'm already there. I don't know about you, but I already feel like I'm living in the wilderness. Well, stepping in the wild means stepping into places far past our comfort zones. It means leaving things like order and control behind us. It means entering new and unknown territory and perhaps even being a little bit vulnerable. Writer Jan Richardson describes the season of Lent in a similar way. She says, and I quote, "Lent disrupts what is comfortable, familiar, known, and startles us out of our customary way of seeing. It is much like stepping into the wild." She says it's in this season of these 40 days, not including Sundays, leading up to Easter and leading up to the cross, where we have to leave behind what is comfortable and are invited to step into an intentional, perhaps vulnerable journey with Jesus. It's in these 40 days where we're reminded of the challenges that Jesus faced, the times he walked in the wilderness, and the ways that he brings about new life and liberation to each one of us. It's an exciting time, this wild and unknown place, but it's also a little bit challenging. And I hope you're willing to take that risk, to take that leap, to take that step with us into the wild. I'm Carter. I'm the lead pastor here at The Walk, and whether you're joining us here on Sunday morning or you're worshiping with us online, we are so glad that you are present with us. We believe that each person is loved by God, no matter where you've been or where you feel like you are going. We also recognize that each person experiences their own kind of wilderness. It might be the wilderness of self-doubt or depression. It might be the wilderness of being a victim of homophobia or racism. It might be the wilderness of losing your job and trying to figure out what's next. It might be the wilderness of deep questions of faith and wondering where God is in all of this. No matter where you are in the wilderness, we want you to know that here at The Walk, you don't have to wander in that wilderness alone, but you have a community around you to support you and love you, as well as the presence of God. Pray with me. Gracious and loving God, no matter where we are or where we go, you are there. You are our constant, steady, sustaining presence. You stay present during our doubt. You comfort during our grief. You strengthen during our weakness. And so we ask that you be our guide during this season. Show us ways that we can walk with you, ways that we can live intentionally, and ways we can love radically. And so this morning, may the words I say and the thoughts and feelings in each of our hearts bring you joy, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Into the wild. Tell me what into the wild, and especially the wild, looks like to you. What is the wild in your mind, or a time when you have encountered it? I mean, we heard from Sarah, it's camping when it is very cold outside.
Fear of the unknown.
Yeah, fear of the unknown. You want to step out, but you're just not sure. That feels like a wild and unknown space. Yeah. When's the time that you were in the wild?
As a detailed and more than a planner, into the wild for me is that stepping out.
Yeah.
Because I guess I've experienced and lived enough that I realize that can be a time of being open and just going with it. Because while it can be scary initially, there's so many blessings and things that happen on the other side after you come through and even during.
So Sandy's saying that as a detailed person and organized and a planner, sometimes stepping out without those into the wild, it can feel like the wild, but it can also lead us to great discoveries. Yeah.
For me, it's having just turned 65. For me, the wild is the unknown occasion.
Ooh, the wild, the unknown of aging. Yes, it's real. Yes. What? Parenthood is one of those wild places. I can imagine so, yes. Sudden health crisis. Sometimes a diagnosis can thrust you into a great unknown and new wilderness. Yeah.
Walking into a medical facility and expecting your husband to be accepted as part of your family, receiving otherwise.
So stepping into a medical facility and wanting your husband to be seen as part of your family, but not being seen as a couple. The wilderness of navigating relationships in a world that doesn't fully support them all of the time. Yeah. Any more times in the wild? Well, I love the wild, but mainly like the nature version of the wild. I'm listening to some of your wilderness experiences and not wanting them of my own, although I can't relate to aging in quite the same way other than in watching the Olympics when they call people my age veterans and soon to be retired. I'm starting to feel a little bit older. But I love going into the wild, particularly when it is going into nature, and especially if it is when I'm invited by friends and I'm not going in there alone. That is how I found myself swimming the rapids at the Whitewater Center outside of Charlotte a few summers ago. And I said swimming. It was more like gracefully not drowning, but with the help of a life jacket. I was supposed to be on top of the rapids in a safe container that was going to take me down them. But I want to explain this to you a little bit more because I said yes when my friend said, let's go kayaking down the Nantahala River. And I said, I don't care if I have only been kayaking twice since I was 12 and I learned a couple of summers at summer camp, but I'm ready. I can handle it. You say when and we'll do it. And so we met at the Whitewater Center so I could practice a couple of my new kayaking skills and brush up on a couple of old ones. And at the Whitewater Center, it is a man-made river system, for lack of a better word. But it is shaped like an 8. Shaped like an 8. And at the top of the 8, so we'll use the iPad here, you've got the middle of the 8. You've got a river going this way, a river going that way. And at the top, there's a pool where everyone just kind of gathers. And then you choose river A or river B based on your difficulty, and you circle around to a bottom pool where you ride a handy-dandy escalator in your raft back up to the top pool, and you can circle around. You can spend a little bit of money and spend a half day doing the circles. You can spend a whole day doing the circles and have a lot of fun. Well, we were there in our own rafts, not with a guide, and we were up in the upper pool, and my friend Rob was teaching me how to roll. That's what happens when your kayak flips upside down and your head's underwater and you got to use the paddle to get right side up again. I never got the roll. But it was a skill necessary to go down the Nantahala, and I couldn't get it. So we decided it was better to focus on other skills. So we decided to practice reading the water, which meant choosing the easier of the two rivers and going down. But we were going to get out before the rapids got too big. There was a small little beach where you could pull out to the side after going down a couple rapids. We were just going to hop out there and not do the whole thing. Well, I made it through the easy part, right? But I missed my exit and found myself going down a big rapid. And keep in mind, you've got all of the folks that are in the whitewater rafts, the professional kayakers. They're just passing you at each one of these moments. And I found myself going down one of these big rapids and into the water. And then I was swimming. I had no idea where my boat was. And I actually felt like I was drowning. I would yell at one of the kayakers going by or another raft boat, help me out, pull me up. And they thought I was having fun. They're like, oh, it's awesome. No, this is not fun. And then they have lifeguards. They have lifeguards that are on the side. And there was also like a 10K going along the path, along the side of the river. And one of the lifeguards was there with a safety rope that they could throw out and pull you. And I'm like, hey, this is why you have the rope. And he's like, you got it. Just swim out until you can get out. I'm like, I'm not swimming. I'm dying in the water. And so I swam out, and I ended up with no paddle. Thank goodness I still had the life jacket. I was missing a shoe, and crawled out and had to walk. It was like a walk of shame back up. Someone had grabbed the boat, still with one shoe, against the current of the 10K back to the top. I made it out alive, but I was definitely scarred. And it taught me a couple of things. It taught me, one, I like entering the wilderness and the wild under my own terms. I do not like being thrust or shoved or dumped out into the wild. And I definitely don't like being in the wild alone. Because sometimes when we're stuck in the wilderness, it can feel like we're drowning in the waves and waving for help. And the lifeguard's like, you got it. Keep going. Keep navigating and riding the current. Well, when we encounter Jesus today, we encounter him right after a wilderness experience, right after a river experience, actually. We're going to meet Jesus today right after his baptism. So Jesus' baptism in the gospel according to Mark is a really short account, but I imagine that it felt a little bit like the rush of the water that I experienced that day. He comes down to the river Jordan to be baptized by his cousin John, but then when he's coming up out of the water, like crazy stuff happens. The heavens open up, the Spirit of God pours out on him, and they proclaim that he is the Son of God. A voice from heaven proclaims that he is the Son of God. It was wild and wonderful, to say the least, but really that was only the beginning. So when we pick up today, we're going to join Jesus right after that announcement and pronouncement that he is the Son of God. And this is what happens next. And I want to encourage you to pay really close attention, because Mark is really short with words. Like, he does not waste time with details. So if you don't pay attention, you're going to miss it. All right, we're going to pick up in Mark 1, verse 12. And the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness for 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. That is Jesus' first experience in the wild. The Spirit drove him out. The verb can be translated sent out, cast out, thrown out into the wilderness. And it insinuates like force and violence, much like I felt when I was dumped out of the boat and forced into the wilderness of the rapids. It's as if Jesus was going not by his own power or will, but the presence of God was encouraging him, leading him, forcing him into that space. Immediately following his baptism, immediately following that identity that he received, he's thrown into the wild, into those spaces like the ones that you named. And as I heard the wildernesses that you all named, like aging and stepping out without a calendar, or fear of the unknown, or parenting, sometimes those are wildernesses that we step into unwillingly. There's not many wildernesses that we step into without the desire to like nip that vacation bug or to nip that in the bud and to calm our desire to be out into the wilderness for one night. But being thrown and being driven into the wilderness, it can feel overwhelming. It can feel like you are drowning, and all you can see is the safety lines a far way off, out of reach, and unwilling to help you. It can feel like you're moving in slow motion and you just want everything to stop, but you can't control it. It can feel like the rush of grief or loss. It can feel like the chaos of a broken relationship or a new diagnosis. Being forced into the wilderness, being thrown out there, can feel like being alone even though you're in a crowded place. It's a place that is far beyond our comfort zone. It's a place that also invites us to see God in a different way. But there's something that happens in the wilderness, like Sandy alluded to earlier. There's something that can happen there. And it's a place where we, like Jesus, face temptation. I love that Mark's version of this is brief. Mark isn't like, here are all the temptations that Jesus faced, and here's how you can solve them if you just are exactly like Jesus. No, Mark keeps it simple. Mark says, in the wilderness, there's temptation. Jesus faced it. You will too. So what are some of the temptations that you face? What are some of the... I shared with you, I'm tempted to look at my phone every 2 seconds, even if there's nothing on there. I'm tempted to think I am much more inclined to the outdoors than I actually am. That's what led me to go swimming that day. I'm tempted to dive into that pride. What about you all? What are some ways that you're tempted? Tempted to spend money you don't have. Yeah. Tempted to try and think our own way out. If only I can outsmart them. Or outsmart what's coming. Yeah. Tempted to withdraw. Yeah. We're tempted to listen to those voices of self-doubt in our heads. Tempted to think that we have to be perfect. Tempted to think, like McKinley was saying, that we can do it on our own. These are temptations that we can face when we are in the wilderness. But as scholar Caroline Lewis says, this isn't our greatest temptation. None of the ones that we've named are our greatest temptation. Our greatest temptation, she says, and I quote, is the temptation to believe that God is not present. Ouch. I know. Our greatest temptation is the temptation to believe that God is not present, especially in the wild. And this last week, I've heard that there have been in the media and in articles and stories about the shooting in Parkland, Florida, and then the fear of repercussions that we've faced here in our schools, as well as the ways that triggers trauma in other places where there have been mass violence. In that wilderness space, the question comes up often, where is God in this? Did God cause this? How does God show up in this space? But I don't believe that all wildernesses are there because the Spirit drives them into them. I believe that sometimes we enter the wilderness of grief and chaos and fear and unknown because we've given in to temptation, because we have given in to sin. And so I don't believe that God caused the things this week or in the months before to happen. But I think that our own willingness to sin and succumb to temptation contributed to them. Our unwillingness to address mental health conditions, our priority to access guns over the safety of our children, our complacency in the wake of mass violence time and time again, our acceptance of exposing our kids to violence through video games and movies in ways that we haven't seen before, our temptation to say that this wilderness of grief couldn't possibly happen to us, our quickness to send thoughts and prayers but slowness to take actions. Sometimes it is our own giving in to temptations that makes us find ourselves in the wilderness. Yet somehow, some way, God is still present in that space. That somehow in the wilderness of chaos and pain and grief and terror and fear, God is still present. We saw this week that God is present in the ways that the students and teachers cared for each other. That God is present in the ways that young prophetic voices ask for justice and change beyond thoughts and prayers. In the ways that teachers and students continue to show up to school the next day. God is present in parents comforting parents. Just as the angels waited on Jesus in the wilderness, so too does the Spirit of God that is present with us stick with us in the wilderness. It is this presence of God that gives us hope. It's the presence of God that gives us hope by shaping us and molding us, by never leaving us or giving up on us or forsaking us, whether it's because we find ourselves in the wilderness in the rushing water because of our own pride and temptation, or because it is the Spirit of God that has brought us there. We are not alone in those spaces. But the presence of God as the gift of new life, the gift of reconciliation and healing, forgiveness, wholeness, justice, mercy, is waiting for us, is present with us, just as the angels waited on Jesus. Our challenge, though, is to embrace the wild, as uncomfortable and cold and fearful as it might be. Whether it is the wild that we are thrown into by the Spirit of God or the wild that we find ourselves in because of our own decisions. Jesus embraced this wilderness experience. He embraced these 40 days in the wild. It was time for him to reflect on his identity as the child of God, as the Son of God. He entertained the presence of wild beasts while he was there. I don't want to gloss over that detail. But he didn't feel threatened by them, nor did they really bond. But he was present with the wild beasts during that time. And so then when Jesus was sent back into the world, and in Mark it happens immediately, he's sent back into a wilderness of its own kind. But he was prepared. When the 40 days were over, he's back in the world preaching and teaching and proclaiming good news, even in the face of the wilderness of losing his cousin, John. But as Jan Richardson says, he shimmers with a clarity that only the wilderness can provide. He shimmers with only a clarity that the wilderness can provide. This clarity of his identity, of his mission, of his call led Jesus throughout his ministry. Because his ministry was one that was rooted in showing up to places and people who were in wilderness experiences, who were vulnerable, who were alone, and who didn't have a hope for tomorrow. He would show up in those spaces proclaiming the good news that not only are they not alone, but that the wild, is not the end of the story. Friends, it's also our wilderness experiences that allow us to continue this ministry of Jesus, to show up in the wilderness spaces of others. I was moved this week when I read about one of the parents who lost her child in the Sandy Hook shooting, went down to Florida to show up to be present with the parents who lost their children there. She had lived through a wilderness that very few people have, and was willing to be that angel, that presence of God to people in the wilderness of grief. So whether you find yourself today on the cusp of the wilderness saying, please, no, don't send me in there. I'm not going to go down the river and get thrown into the water. I'm not willing to take a step into the wild. Or you find yourself lost in the wild of your own, or you're on the other side of the wilderness. You once were lost, but now feel found and rooted. Our challenge is to proclaim how God is present in that space, to be willing to be and reflect the presence of God for others. Because no matter where we are not alone, and God is with us, giving us that strength. Amen. Let us pray. God of grace, we are grateful that we are not asked to face whatever temptation life brings us alone. Whether we find ourselves in the wilderness from our own decisions, our own temptations, and our own neglect, or we find ourselves in the wilderness because it's your Spirit that has brought us there. We're grateful that we're not alone and that it is only by your grace and your presence that we can navigate our way out. Be with us this season as we're willing to linger a little longer in the wild and encounter your presence in new ways. And perhaps maybe we can reflect your presence to others who are in the wild of their own. Amen.